In the last tutorial, we stressed the centrality and pivotal role of the financial contract. Closely related to the idea of the financial contract is the concept of contract types, or CT in short. To expound this idea is the target of this tutorial. In order to understand the content and especially the context of this specific tutorial, it is essential that you have listened already tutorial 01 and its related UFA lectures. Also UFA lecture 3 and the corresponding third chapter of the book have to be read beforehand. To get the core of the idea of a contract type, we have first to ask ourselves, what is a financial contract? In its very essence, a financial contract is an agreement between two counterparties to exchange cash flows along the timeline. Think about the mortgage you might have gotten from your bank. The bank agreed lending and paying you a certain amount of money, and you agreed to pay principal and interest following certain patterns. For example, you could pay principal and interest monthly in the form of an annuity. Business contracts normally exchange goods for money. The financial contract exchanges money for money. From this follows that the financial contract is the only contract where the investment and its return is written into a single contract, following rules or preset patterns. These two facts make the financial contract the easiest investment decision and banking rather an easy business. Nevertheless, banks haven't made much out of this advantage. Of course, the idea of Actus is to change that. One single pattern we call contract type, or CT. This is an example of such a pattern. Here, for example, we see an outgoing cash flow. Which is then followed by a payback. Here. Here we see a series of interest accruals and payments, etc. Finally, and this is maybe the most astonishing fact, the number of patterns is rather small and manageable. Working with patterns needs some grouping. The very first high-level groups are the basic contract types and the combined contract types, or, since we will use the word again and again, CTs. So basic here, combined. Basic CTs comprises, roughly speaking, the typical financial contracts one expects on the banking book of a bank. I say roughly, since it will also include borderline cases such as guarantees and commodities. But abstracting from this, it coincides well with all types of loan making and deposit taking or general refinancing of banks. Basic CTs are also called basic because they establish the origin of all financial products. In other words, this means they form the underlying instruments of the more sophisticated products such as swaps, futures, and options. This brings us to the next group, the combined contract types. You find combined contract types generally on the trading book. However, there are also a lot of basic CTs on the trading books, such as bonds and stocks. Combined CTs refer roughly to the derivatives section of the trading book. Again, one has to take some exceptions into account, such as a callable bond, which is a combined on-balance sheet product. Combined CTs are in some cases just the sum of basic CTs. For example, a classical swap is made up of two basic CTs, one being an asset and the other a liability. A huge majority of the swaps can be precisely modeled with this mechanism. Structured products are often nothing else than a bundle of simple basic CTs. Even the underlying of, say, an interest rate future is nothing else than a bullet loan with a certain term to maturity, a rate, and an interest payment cycle. The same holds true for the underlying contracts of most of the options. Of course, combined contract types can have other combined CTs as underlying of instruments, like a swaption, which is an option on a swap. A swap has two children. This explains also the relationship between the two groups. At the bottom of even the most sophisticated and challenging financial derivatives, one finds basic contract types. As we will see as we go along, financial analysis starts always at the bottom with basic CTs. Once this is established, we move up higher through the levels till the top. So calculation starts here and then moves in this direction. And if it's a combined of combined, it continues. Due to this fact, we do model the underlying instruments of derivatives exactly the same way as we model the basic contract types, as we model a loan or a deposit or a mortgage. This is also the reason for the 100% consistency between all we do. Basic CTs roughly correspond to on-balance sheet or banking book products. Here we see the main categories of basic CTs. Fixed income instruments on the left groups all contracts related to these instruments. It doesn't matter whether the interest rate of the instrument is really fixed or floating or follows even some other mechanism, but it always refers to an interest. So they are all called fixed income. Fixed income is split again into the two main groups of non-maturities and maturities. Non-maturity contract types are all those financial contracts with fuzzy or vaguely defined terms. Money can be recalled anytime with or maybe without restrictions, and banks can change their interest rate terms at will. Typical example of this group is the saving account, as found in many countries. Current accounts, I give another example. In countries like Switzerland, even some mortgages follow the same pattern. Many financial contracts follow this pattern. In terms of numbers, it is probably the most prevalent contract type. Most people in the banked world have at least one non-maturity contract. Imagine the billions of saving and current accounts in China, India, and the rest of Asia. Many children, when they are born, they get a saving account from a bank or from some grandparent. Non-maturity contract types need little initial data, but a lot of modeling in order to get analytical results. Maturity contracts are the opposite. They have well-defined terms both regarding principal and interest. Maturity contracts are therefore quite demanding in terms of initial data and the underlying algorithms. However, once set, analytics become easy. The most common maturity contract type is the principal at maturity. Or PAM in short. In this pattern, all principal is paid in at once at the beginning and paid back in one shot at maturity, like the one we saw a few slides back. Most bonds follow this pattern, but also many loans. Money market is another example. Call money or CLM does not have a predefined maturity date. This is popular among banks. Sometimes governments issue perpetual bonds, or PBN, especially in war times or other stressed situations. Perpetual bonds are never paid back. Together, they form the group of bullet instruments. Annuity, or ANN in Actus notation, is the pattern of a typical mortgage, where principal and interest sum up to a constant. Negative amortizers, or NGMs, are similar, however, with a difference that the amount at the rate reset is not adjusted, wherefore the principal amortization can even become negative. Regular amortizers, or RGMs, they differ in respect that the principal payment is a constant and interest payment is reduced over time. Together, they comprise the group of amortizing instruments. Finally, we have yet the exotic variants of the amortizing instruments. They are exotic in the sense that they can vary the conditions over time. Alone, these two instruments, together with the non-maturity contracts, which we just discussed in the previous slide, they make up the big bulk of banking book transactions. Maybe, I'm guessing we will see in the validation phase, but my guess is 70% of the world financial contracts, the on-balance sheet contracts, are made up of these three contract types. So you wonder why we need 30 contract types. This shows also that we will go into really some detail, even including exotic options, not, of course, hyper-exotic options. We continue with the overview of basic contract types. The next group is the group of stocks. These are the classical stocks or shares as they are traded on the stock exchange. The next group is the commodity group. It could be argued whether commodity is a financial contract and belonging into this list. While a commodity is certainly not a financial contract, they do act as underlying instruments of important financial contracts. Think of the commodity futures and options. For this reason, commodities do belong to the list. Typical commodities controlled with such systems are oil, electricity, staple food, and metals. Insurance, especially life insurance contracts, are essentially financial contracts. They are, however, not part of the first phase of Actus, but they should become part in a later phase. Finally, we have the basic credit risk related contracts, whereof the main contract is the guarantee. Within a financial contract, there are many variables that define a partial rule of the cash flow exchange. For example, there are variables to describe interest payments, to describe rate reset, etc. By multiplying these different states of these variables with each other, we could easily reach astronomical numbers. If each of the combinations were a contract type, it couldn't be handled anymore. So the question arises, what kind of difference does it take to justify a new contract type versus just a parameter within a contract type? In other words, which of the mechanisms are just parameters within a contract type and which parameters call for a new contract type? Before answering this question, I want to illustrate the problem with an analogy of the alphabet. Alphabets, sound alphabets, represent sound. Although there are different sounds within different languages, the number of sounds, even on a world level, is limited. Despite this, the problem of certain sound-letter combination is solved differently in different languages. Take the sound sh, which we find in Germanic, but also in many Slavic languages and surely in many other languages. In German, the sound is represented by the three letters S, C, H. And in some Slavic languages, I think they write it like this. I find the Slavic way much more efficient, especially since sh is a very common sound in German. Why use three letters? But this was a choice. You can argue about other letters, like some people argue that the letter Y and Q are superfluous, since they can be easily represented by other letters, and so we could argue on and on, what should be and what should not be. Fact is that at the end of the day the alphabet works. Even if it's slightly imperfect, it works, and it works for all the languages. Similar arguments we could have when discussing when to add a contract type and when not. There is surely the argument of expediency, but even then choices are open to discussion. Here is the rationale behind our choice of defining CTs. Our first target is to keep the number of CTs manageable. A few dozen is in our view manageable. If the big bulk of the cash flow of a financial contract is different to other existing contracts, it justifies a new contract type. Basic CTs, for example, differ mainly by the way the principal cash flow, and the principal forms the big bulk in this case, how this is generated. Finally, if the rules or the algorithms which drive the cash flows are very different, then also a new contract type is justified. For example, all the amortizing instruments produce similar types of cash flows, but their algorithms are very different. So we need new contract types. Guided by these rules, we arrive at something which is very close to how practitioners see the world of financial products. Small rules with little impact on the overall cash flows are parameters inside the contract types. Big, impacting rules demand a new algorithm and justify a new contract type. If you look at transaction systems which manage these contracts, that's exactly how they are organized. Finally, we come yet to the overview of combined contract types. Combined CTs are closely related to derivatives and trading positions. On the left side we have what we call the symmetric derivatives. Symmetric points to the symmetric nature of the payoff, which can be positive or negative depending on the risk factors. They are again split into swaps on one hand and futures on the other. Options, they have an asymmetric payoff. Depending whether you are the buyer or the seller of the instrument, you either can only win or lose if it disregards the initial payment. Options are again grouped into basic instruments and exotic. Basic instruments are the classical American, European or Bermudan options, and exotic instruments cover anything like digital, barrier, knock-in, double knock-in, or also options like Asian, rainbow and other variations. At this point, there is no need to go into details. The target was getting an overview, and I hope we have reached that. Each contract type will be presented and discussed and covered with a special lecture. Thank you.